Fronto tells Marcus to practice repeatedly taking philosophical ideas and paraphrasing them. So he says you have to keep turning them over and practice putting them
Mhm.
in different words until you capture exactly the right image, figure of speech, phrase to articulate the idea.
Welcome to Stoa Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros, and today I am speaking with the excellent Donald Robertson, the author of How to Think Like a Roman Emperor and the new Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic Emperor. Thanks again for joining.
Thanks, Caleb. It's a pleasure. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today, as always.
Good. Excellent. Me too. So how has your picture of Marcus Aurelius changed from how to think like a Roman emperor?
It has changed a bit, hasn't? I don't know if it's changed dramatically, but it has changed in some ways. So a bit of context, I suppose. I've written 3 books in a row about the same guy now, which is too many. Although I've just finished writing a book, as we were saying earlier, about another guy, Socrates. So I have moved on a little bit. And I wrote How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which is kind of a self-help with a lot of biographical anecdotes. Then I wrote a graphic novel about him. And then I was asked by Yale University Press to write a more conventional kind of prose biography about Marcus Aurelius, focusing on his character. So a kind of narrative biography rather than an academic one, and focusing on how Stoicism influences him as emperor. The thing that really maybe changed my perception of Marcus Aurelius the most was maybe writing the graphic novel, because I had to really visualize his life. And I think that benefited me enormously in writing the prose biography, because I think really a good biographer, a bad biographer just kind of shuffles words around in a sense, especially if you're working with
Mhm.
classical text. You go, I don't know, Diogenes Laertius says this and Cassius Dio says that, and kind of paraphrasing those guys. But a good biographer will really shut his eyes and just try and imagine what it was actually like to be on the Danube frontier in the winter with a hacking cough, talking to a load of Germanic tribal chieftains that had recently betrayed you, shortly after your brothers died of the plague or whatever, and to try and really put yourself in those shoes. So a good biographer would really try and visualize how these things overlap and how one would influence another and so on. Challenging to do it. That requires kind of creative thinking in a way. So that challenge helped me a lot. And funnily enough, so first of all, I'd say that the plague I would see is having more of an impact on Marcus Aurelius's life than it might seem at first. But also, if I try and put myself in Marcus Aurelius's shoes, I have to say the first thing that strikes me is that this guy must have awoken every morning and kind of pinched himself and thought, it's amazing that I'm still alive. And he compared to particularly how we are in the modern world, where death is kind of, we're protected from some of these things, obviously more than people were in the ancient world. People in the ancient world saw animals being slaughtered for their meat and things. Well, that's all sanitized for us. We buy it in the supermarket wrapped in cellophane or whatever. We don't have to watch animals being butchered. We don't watch people dying in front of us. They're sent up to hospices and things like that. The pandemic that we had, I think part of the issue with it in a way was that, although millions of people died, most of us didn't really witness that happening. It seemed kind of abstract. So many people, for example, trivialize that or imagine it wasn't happening. They didn't really see exactly what's going on. Their perception was very different from doctors and nurses that were working with COVID patients, for instance. But in Marcus Aurelius's world, these things were more immediate. Also, many, many Roman emperors were poisoned. Officials were poisoned or died under suspicious circumstances around Marcus. He was certainly threatened with a civil war, and what goes hand in hand with that is the threat of assassination or being deposed and killed as well. He had constant health problems. He lived through a
Mhm.
plague. When he fought the war on the Danube, there really was a risk that he would have been killed. He wasn't in battle, He probably stayed most of the time in fortresses, although there's some reason to believe he actually went into the field, but probably not close to the action. But nevertheless, I mean, Carnuntum, the main fortress where we know he was stationed, seems to have been overrun, and 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed in a battle there. I mean, it's quite possible that Marcus could have been killed during that campaign. So there were multiple reasons that he had to be concerned or grateful that he was still alive, I think, each day. I think also people surrounding Marcus Aurelius, he says himself in the Meditations that many of the people around him were waiting for him to die. A lot of people wanted him to die. And I think he had that sense, people want me to die. Some of them might want to assassinate me. I've got health problems. In the ancient world, if you get a cough or a fever, it's not like today, where you go to the doctor and you get a diagnosis or whatever. In the ancient world, you're on a wing and a prayer. You wake up with a fever, there's a pretty good chance you might drop dead the next day for all you know. Like, who knows what's causing it? And also, he was bereaved to an extent that most of us would find hard to imagine. He lost many family members, but also 7 of his children predeceased him, which is, try and imagine that. For a moment, it's quite hard to wrap your head around. So the combination of the threats to his own life, people dying around him, the visibility of the plague, he would see funeral pyres burning, mass graves, people blind perhaps, or disabled permanently because of the effects of plague. Really, it's no surprise that this is a man who thought contemplation of his own death was an important Stoic exercise that he dwells on. More, for example, he dwells on it, I would say, more than Seneca does. So it's no surprise that he's a Stoic. He's contemplating these things. But, maybe he has a special interest in certain aspects of Stoicism. Certainly what's prominent in the Meditations is contemplation of death. So I think I learned that Marcus Aurelius is a guy who had a strong sense on a regular basis throughout most of his adult life of his own mortality. And that really, I think, affected his character.
And is there any place where you think about the events or decisions that Marcus Aurelius made during his reign differently?
I have different views from many people about some of the things that he did or that happened. One of them is, I know that many people think, even Cassius Dio says, the biggest mistake that Marcus made was appointing Commodus as his successor.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask you about this.
Yeah. I mean, my view is that Marcus would have seen that differently, and that he would have been more concerned, I think, to avoid the risk of a civil war. The Roman Empire was fragmented in half for 3 months during his reign. And it happened. So again, that's how fragile he must have had the sense of the fragility of his own existence. He definitely also had a sense of the fragility of Roman civilization as well. It wasn't a done deal. It wasn't stable. It did fragment. And then luckily they managed to kind of weld it back together in the civil war of Avidius Cassius, sorry. So I think he was more concerned that didn't happen again. And the Senate, I'm pretty sure, were more concerned. And then I was kind of gratified, actually, to find there's an obscure part of Plutarch where I think it's in the Life of Brutus, where he refers to a guy that we believe is a Stoic saying the same thing that I would interpret Marcus as thinking, which is that a bad emperor is better than a civil war in terms of their, I guess, political theory. And so I think that's why Commodus was appointed. If we pretty much know who would have been the alternative. It would have been Pompeianus, Marcus's son-in-law, for sure. He married Lucilla, who was the widow of Lucius Verus. So in Roman society, she was an Augusta, which is kind of like being an empress. She was the widow of Marcus's co-emperor. So Pompeianus was the son-in-law of Marcus Aurelius. He was his most senior general on the Danube, and he was married to an empress, a Roman empress. So he was a hair of bread from being appointed emperor. And we're told that he was asked or invited to become Caesar, the heir to Roman Empire, 3 times altogether, but declined each time. So the story really, in a sense, is about why did this guy refuse to become emperor? And I think, in part, and by the way, the character of Maximus in Gladiator, I like to, maybe I'm being paradoxical in this, because I know that people like to say Gladiator's complete nonsense historically, but actually I think there's more like in it that echoes Roman history than people realize. So the character of Maximus in it is loosely based on this actual guy, Pompeianus, Marcus's son-in-law. Why was he unwilling to become emperor? He was an equestrian, so not of the senatorial class, and he wasn't of noble or patrician birth. So he was of relatively humble means. Marcus was known for operating a meritocratic system and promoting humble origins, and that we know that that was controversial and it upset a lot of Roman elites. And so and we know that Pompeianus's marriage to Lucilla was controversial. So it may be that they just thought, if this guy becomes emperor, there's going to be another civil war, because some of the provinces are just going to break away and say, not a chance. He's not an aristocrat. His family aren't even senators, who existed. And it just gives them an opportunity, an excuse to have a rebellion. And actually, the civil war that Marcus faced is probably really linked to that, because it's no coincidence that Avidius Cassius and Pompeianus are both Marcus's 2 most senior generals, and they were both born close to each other. They're both Syrian. But Avidius Cassius was of absolutely blue-blooded family. He was a descendant of Herod the Great, and also a distant descendant of Augustus. So he couldn't have more blue blood in his family, this guy. So Marcus's 2 senior generals are both Syrian dudes, and one of them is kind of middle class, if you like, or whatever. Like he's equestrian anyway. He's not from the upper echelons of Roman society per se. This other guy couldn't have more royal pedigree and comes from the senatorial class. And that might be one of the reasons that Avidius Cassius instigated the civil war, because he just thought, not a chance. You're promoting this guy above me? Like, that would have been probably insulting to him.
Right.
And you would, I think, have seen more of that. And so I think the Senate would have said, whoa, we need to make sure this doesn't happen. Even a rubbish emperor, even your son, who's like, is an embarrassment, maybe, would be better than the Roman Empire being torn into fragments and, possibly collapsing.
Right. Yeah, I think we underrate today how the importance of bloodlines to ancient peoples.
People often say that the preceding emperors had set this precedent of adopting someone, but they didn't have suitable heirs. And there's no question that people in the Roman Empire, to some extent in Rome even, but definitely in the east of the empire, 100%, and in the other provinces, believed that the rightful successor of the emperor would be his son. And if you didn't appoint Commodus, you're left with a pretender in the wings. I mean, it would be a death sentence for Commodus, essentially. Like, he'd almost certainly. Rivals to the Roman throne tend not to live very long. Like, basically, for obvious reasons. You can't have a guy that should have been the emperor hanging around. Like, if he's got a lot of money and a lot of powerful friends and stuff like that, even if he's a nothing, people are going to rally around him and make him into. Commodus would become a useful idiot or whatever. He would. Other people who were smarter, more cunning, more aggressive would have exploited him as an opportunity to challenge Pompeianus or whoever Marcus had appointed. And I really, we're told that it was Lucius Verus, first of all, that insisted that Marcus appoint Commodus and one of his other sons as heirs. And then there's a letter from the Senate that purportedly insists that Marcus has to grant imperial powers to Commodus and make him a full-blown co-emperor. I mean, Commodus was made emperor about 3 years before Marcus died. So that's different from Gladiator. He's not Caesar, he's emperor already by the time that Marcus dies. But the Senate seemed to have thought, we need to sort this out, especially because we've already had a civil war. We can't afford to run the risk of another one. There's only so much harm the emperor can do. But a civil war, like, the problem with the thing that really freaked Romans out in the civil war is, like, to a large extent, many Romans felt they were relatively safe if there was a war on the frontiers, because Rome itself's quite far away from where a lot of these, although they were devastating, it's pretty far away from the border with Parthia. And, a lot of Romans didn't have to go and fight in the legions. But civil war is a whole different ballgame. Like, when Caesar had his civil war, Rome was evacuated. So powerful elite Romans were like, no, this would bring war to our very doorstep. We can't allow it. So sure, this guy's a jerk, perhaps, but perhaps he's an alcoholic as well. There's some reason to believe. Like many purple Romans, he may have actually been an alcoholic, possibly even using other substances. But I think they thought it was the least worst option.
Sure. And he's, as soon as you come into existence, Commodus is going to have partisans that are going to need to be dealt with. And it is always interesting, as you say, that I think one of the first rules of taking the throne is to eliminate any potential rivals, especially these rivals by blood. So that's always important to keep in mind, I suppose, if you're thinking of becoming Roman emperor. I wanted to ask you about Marcus Aurelius is often critiqued for the Marcomannic Wars.
Yeah.
So they're sort of seen as like these imperial enterprises. To what extent do you think that criticism is accurate?
I think usually, first of all, it's a very complicated question to answer. And like many historical questions, I don't think we can give a conclusive answer. And we have to deal with the fact that our modern assumptions and values are going to be completely out of kilter with what would be the norm in Roman society. So it's a tricky question to answer. However, I'd start off by saying that usually when people say this, they've got no idea what they're talking about, right? Like, they just think he had a lot of wars, so therefore he's a warmonger. And that's like the extent of the argument usually. And I think the reality is a lot more complicated than that. For instance, many of the Germanic peoples that he was fighting wanted to migrate into the Roman Empire. And so ironically, he's kind of fighting against people who want to be integrated into Rome. They think it's going to be a better, more comfortable life for them. And one thing that we're told, then it raises the problem, how much can we actually trust the Roman histories in this regard? But for what it's worth, bracketing that for now, like what the Roman histories tell us is that Marcus, first of all, relied extensively on diplomacy. One of the reasons for the civil war, it's pretty clear, was that there was a faction of powerful Roman senators and generals who thought that Marcus was too much of a military dove. They thought the war was too expensive and going on too long, not because Marcus, I think, was just decided to fight an expensive war, because Marcus was relying too much on diplomacy. And I think they would have had more of a kind of scorched air policy, like, let's just kill all these guys, like, be done with them kind of thing. Or let's just, use fear. I mean, we're told stories which seem exaggerated about Avidius Cassius strapping like dozens and dozens of Sarmatian tribesmen to a huge wooden post, presumably on a hilltop, and setting fire to them to send a message to the local tribesmen to say, don't mess with the Roman Empire. There are too many of these guys for us to fight. We need to intimidate them into submission. We're told Avidius Cassius used to just chain dozens of captured enemies together, take them out in a boat into the middle of the Danube and push them in the river to drown like animals. Like, is the quickest, easiest way to execute hordes of them. And so those guys, I think, would have been doing that, perhaps. The Roman war was brutal, like at the best of times. But Marcus, we hear a lot more about his emphasis on negotiation, on diplomacy, on peace treaties, on trade agreements to try and use economics to influence the Germanic tribes. The other thing we have to bear in mind is many of these tribes, there were lots of them, and they were often fighting each other. And in some cases, we're told that some of them insisted that Marcus come into the war, particularly in the Second Marcomannic War. The Sarmatians demanded that Marcus fight the Quadi, it's a complicated kind of dynamic that's going on. It's not just like one side versus the other. They also keep switching sides, and they're notorious for it. So the Germanic tribes, many of them would join forces with the Romans and be fighting against other Germanic tribes, and then they kind of switch back again and switch back and forth. So it's much, and sadly, it's very complicated. And to make it even more complicated, just like politics today, we say this country went to war against that country, but in every country there are multiple political factions, and power switches hands between them. So, I mean, it may be that there's a faction, there's usually a pro-war and an anti-war faction, or a pro-Rome and an anti-Rome faction in another country. So it's too simplistic to say Marcus is fighting against this country. In a sense, he's fighting against the current regime in that country, and that may be then replaced by a regime that's allied to Rome, and now they're buddies with them. Right. But the common people that live in that country, who knows what their feelings were about which regime did they prefer? Did they prefer the anti-Rome regime, or maybe they were sick of fighting Rome and they'd much rather be allied to them? It's hard to know for sure. But we're told that Marcus, we're told much more about him resettling large numbers, many thousands of captured Germanic tribesmen. We're told that he had a problem with the Sarmatians. And the problem was that they were a nomadic civilization. And so it would be difficult, basically effectively impossible to resettle them within the bounds of the Roman Empire. And to resettling, one reason for resettling tribesmen is to disarm them. So you can say, you guys have to hand over your weapons, and you're all going to work on like farms and stuff like that, to beat your swords into plowshares, as we say. Right? So come inside the empire, stop fighting us, get rid of all your weapons. We can keep an eye on you then. Right? And also, in a sense, their families would be kind of like hostages, potentially. You could put it from one point of view. Their wives and children, like now inside the Roman Empire as well. So the Sarmatians, what we're told Marcus did was to recruit them as massive auxiliary cavalry units. And normally in different empires, kingdoms in the ancient world, often what happens when you recruit enemies into your own army is that you send them as far away as possible. So you don't want these Sarmatian guys close to home in case they just decide to rebel. Like he sent them to Britain. Sure. He sent them to Britain, like supposedly, which must have been, is the stuff of fan fiction, or alternative history. There's a movie called King Arthur that's in which King Arthur is a Romano-British Roman general and governor, and it's about these Sarmatians being sent to ancient Britain. So it's hard to imagine what would that have been like. It must have been a bit of a culture shock. But that's one of the things we were told that Marcus actually did. So really not using enslavement. They're not talking about him enslaving these people or auctioning them as slaves, which would have been done, or just killing them. The Romans didn't really have prisoner of war camps, right? And so sometimes what seems brutal to us, I mean, actually, even slavery, in the eyes of many people in the ancient world, was justified because they thought, if you capture enemy soldiers, do you just give them a stern ticking off and then send them home? But then they're just going to attack you again, right? Or do you just do Avidius Cassius and just round them all up and drown them en masse? Seems kind of brutal, right? So an alternative would be, what do you do with them then? Like, we don't really have prisoner of war camps. You auction them as slaves, and that allows you to disarm them and keep them under control. Or you resettle them within the empire, and that allows you to keep them under control. But then probably what Marcus did at one point eventually was he was going to cross the Danube. He started to build Roman forts across the Danube. So they would have kind of colonized Sarmatia and Marcomannia, I think they were going to call it, and build 2 new Roman provinces. And again, that sounds like he's invading other countries and stuff, but it may have been that some of the people in those countries were actually fine with that because it would have brought them peace.
Right.
And they wanted to migrate to northern Italy, for example, anyway. And this is perhaps a kind of compromise to say, okay, we can bring you into the empire, but you guys are going to have to stay in this region. So Roman politics, I think, the wars are a little bit more complicated than they seem at first. But in essence, the impression I get is that Marcus was seen as not aggressive enough and faced a civil war for being too much of a military dove, which is obviously at all odds with the criticism that people sometimes raise today that he was too much of a military hawk.
Right. I think today we think that argument is basically, well, these Germanic tribes must have been hanging out on their own, more or less, and then as a part of some imperial colonial adventure, the Romans come in and kill many of them and exploit the rest, which of course has some amount of truth in it, but is far too simplistic of a picture.
It could be that if we could go back in time and do a kind of vox pop, get a microphone and say to an average like Marcomanni or Quadi, so what's it like? It'd be really interesting. I don't know what their opinion would be. Our views of what wars in history are usually kind of one-dimensional and simplistic anyway. But certainly a lot of them wanted to live in northern Italy, and the Quadi in particular were Roman client state. So their governor probably was someone who had been raised in Rome. And so what you have to imagine, in a sense, is a guy who was maybe born there but raised in Rome and educated there, who would be in charge of the country. And they were probably one of the most prosperous tribes. They were the largest tribe in the region and probably one of the most prosperous ones because they controlled the amber road through which a lot of trade, particularly amber, came down to Rome. So they had a favorable relationship and a strong trade incentive to remain allies of the Roman Empire. So when they rebel, it could be that many people in that country thought, these are radicals that have come to power and they're really jeopardizing the welfare of everybody else in this region by instigating a war against the Romans. Maybe we preferred it, when it was peaceful here and we could make money from trade. We were doing pretty well. But who knows? Because we have very limited and biased sources. But certainly it's a more complicated question, I think, than me. Assuming there is some reason to believe that Marcus was following his Stoic principles and trying to engage in more of a just war that was guided by diplomacy. In the Meditations, there aren't many. One of the peculiar things about the Meditations is there are a number of peculiar things about the Meditations stylistically. One is it's written in quite an artfully vague way. So a good example of that would be sometimes Marcus, in particular in book 1, Marcus mentions a bunch of specific people. But throughout the rest of the Meditations, despite sometimes mentioning very specific people and events, at the same time, it's also incredibly vague. Like, he only mentions the Antonine Plague very briefly and on a very indirect way. He uses it as a sort of metaphor for something else. He refers to war in general terms. for example, in perhaps the most famous passage in the Meditations, which is the first passage in Book 2, he says, every morning when you wake up, tell yourself that you're going to meet deceitful and ungrateful people. He doesn't say who they are or even what sort of people he's talking about. But you can bet your bottom dollar he must have had some specific people in mind, surely, when he wrote that. If I said that, you said that, like, you'd have some examples in mind. And now
Hmm.
Roman statesmen had a formal meeting every morning, where they would receive visitors, especially the emperor would have received senators, courtiers, Germanic envoys first thing every morning. So he must have that in mind, although he doesn't make it clear. So sometimes he's speaking in very vague terms, and you could say, well, I guess. And the odd thing about that passage is he says you must remind yourself that these people are your kin, not through blood, like, or not through birth, but through your shared humanity. Now, that's a remarkable thing for a guy to say about the emissaries of a nation that he's currently in the middle of fighting a war against. Like, that's, and he must have them in mind. But the only time he specifically mentions them is there's a very cryptic passage. And I know recently I found someone that actually interpreted this in a completely different way. But there's a passage where he says capturing Sarmatians would be like catching fish in a net, or he says like catching, I think he says like a fly being caught in a spider's web, and taking pride in that would be a form of brigandry, he says. So it's a little bit of a cryptic passage. Capturing Sarmatians and taking pride in it, it sounds like he's suggesting or certainly implying that enslaving enemy soldiers is somehow unjust. Now, that would be a very odd thing for a Roman emperor to say if it wasn't for the fact that we have some evidence that this was an established Stoic argument against slavery. I wish we knew more about that, because there's no reference to Marcus auctioning enemy soldiers as slaves. And there are many references to him doing contrary things, like I said, resettling them or recruiting them into auxiliary units. I mean, also, you could, just to show some balance here, you could say that recruiting soldiers into an auxiliary unit was potentially not much fun. Like, if he's sending them off to fight in a war and they might die. But I'm pretty sure they would have preferred that to a life of slavery. There's one point where he mentions the war. And so he says the opposite of, I'm a warmonger and I love butchering people. He says capturing Sarmatians is barbaric. As if you're capturing an animal, like, as if you're catching a hare or catching fish in a net. There's someone who thinks about that as a good thing is basically like a thief or a brigand. That's not something you'd expect a warmonger to say.
Right, right. Yeah, I suppose that there's perhaps strategic reasons for Marcus not to include too many personal details in his journal, which is unfortunate, but I think makes sense. They didn't have the biographers in mind.
Yeah, I mean, right, but he actually is quite remarkable what he doesn't say in the Meditations. Like that, it's interesting. When you study ancient texts, we've got such limited source material. You have to do some mental gymnastics to try and almost like squeeze as much information as you can out of them. And there are tactics that you would use to do that. But one of them is just to ask yourself, well, what's omitted here? What's missing from this text? A good example of that is Book 1, where Marcus has a kind of structure to it, and he lists 17 individuals that he admires. You can measure the number of words and see that he says far more about Antoninus Pius and, to some extent, Junius Rusticus than he does about anyone else. But there's a couple of people that get 0 words that should be in there. And one of them is Hadrian, who is Marcus's adoptive grandfather, the person that chose him to become a Caesar, and the guy had a great influence over Marcus's early life. And Marcus lived in Hadrian's villa for the last 4 or 5 months of Hadrian's life. He saw his decline and death. Marcus mentions Hadrian 3 or 4 times later in the Meditations, but only to use him as an example of someone who was very powerful and famous and now is dust. So as a contemplation, a memento mori. But he has nothing positive to say about him. And in Roman society, that was something they were much more sensitive to than we are today. That's a grave insult. It's one of the reasons I don't believe that the Meditations was intended for publication, because I think there are a number of reasons, but that's just one. And then the other person he doesn't mention is Herodes Atticus, who was the most celebrated intellectual of the era. He was the leading figure at that time of the second sophistic, so he was a sophist. He was a family friend of Marcus Aurelius. Marcus knew him his entire life. He was still alive towards the end of Marcus's life, and he visited him in Athens. But Herodes lived for a while in the household of Marcus's maternal great-grandfather. It's the same household as Marcus's mother. And he was appointed Marcus's main Greek rhetoric tutor. So he had a strong family connection. The guy was his personal tutor. He was the most famous intellectual in the world. He was incredibly influential, wealthy, although controversial. I mean, he's an interesting guy because if you go to Greece today, sometimes you might think, gee, there's a lot of Greek history that there aren't any traces of today. There are several buildings that still stand as monuments to Herodes Atticus, because he was the sort of, Elon Musk or, Jeff Bezos type figure. He was one of the wealthiest men in the world, and he constructed a number of monuments and buildings. The Odeon of Herodes Atticus is one of the main tourist attractions. The Foo Fighters played a concert there. They often have concerts there in Greece today. But Marcus doesn't mention this guy at all. As one of his he mentions his teachers, doesn't mention
He
this.
mentioned several tutors.
Yeah, but not his most famous teacher. And worse, he mentions a guy whose name he can't remember, who he says was a Trophaeus, or a kind of nanny tutor when he would have been up until the age of 7, I think, like a small child. He would have had this tutor in his grandfather's household. And he says he learned some moral lessons from this guy that remained with him for the rest of his life. They sound similar to ideas in Cynic philosophy, but maybe that's just a coincidence. But he doesn't seem to remember this guy's name, and most scholars believe he was probably a slave or a former slave, a freedman. And so Marcus cites him as one of the teachers that influenced him the most, and doesn't say anything about Herodes Atticus. That would be the modern equivalent if somebody's mum had grown up in the same household as Jordan Peterson, and Jordan Peterson was appointed your personal tutor for most of your adolescence. And then when you were writing your biography, you said that the person that had the biggest moral impact on your education was your nanny, whose name you can't remember, and you didn't mention deriving anything of value whatsoever from Jordan Peterson, right? So if you published that, people would be like, wow, that's like a kind of implicit insult, really, like by omission. In Roman society, multiply that by 10, because they were much more sensitized to this kind of thing. So that's missing.
Right. Yeah, that's
and then
interesting.
the other thing he does is that sometimes people get short shrift. So Lucius Verus is co-emperor. Now look at how much he says about Antoninus Pius. And not only that, later in the book, he does it again, and he lists all the things he admires about Antoninus Pius. He does it twice. And I think there may be another passage as well where he kind of touches on it briefly. Then Lucius Verus is his co-emperor. All he says is that he was loyal and affectionate. So that's damning someone with faint praise. That's it. And those aren't even particularly good compliments. He was loyal, as opposed to what? Like, that's like the minimum requirement for a co-emperor, right? It's like, what's the best that you can say about this guy? At least he didn't betray me. Like, well, that's something, I guess. And he was affectionate. He was your adoptive brother, and you grew up together. Like, at least he didn't hate my guts. Like, he didn't try to kill me. Like, although the Roman histories kind of suggest that there was some friction between them. So he really seems to damn Lucius Verus with faint praise. But so that's kind of when you're doing a biography, you have to, I guess, look at what people don't say. Kind
Right.
of compare and contrast what they're saying about different things, and then you can squeeze, maybe if you're lucky, a little bit more meaning out of the
Yeah.
limited resources that we have.
Right. What of Marcus Aurelius's actions do you think most embodied his Stoic philosophy? So where's that tight connection between the philosophy you see in Meditations and his life?
Now, the first thing I'd say is the Roman histories don't give us many clear examples of that, but we wouldn't necessarily expect them to. That's not so much what they're interested in. And they don't, but they would often say if someone's life was inconsistent with their values. So there's an argument from silence there. I don't think anyone ever in the ancient world accused Marcus Aurelius of behaving inconsistently with his Stoicism. And in fact, he was, contrary to what some people have said, he was famous as a Stoic philosopher during his lifetime and afterwards.
Mhm.
So, like, they do seem to portray him as a philosopher king, as someone who's consistent, acts in a way that's consistent. And in fact, there's one or two places where they imply some people were annoyed with him because they thought he was too Stoic. He was too influenced by Stoicism as an emperor and some of the decisions he made. But they're a little bit vague about exactly what the connection would be. And, in some cases, I think it's actually hard for us to reconstruct because we have limited information about Stoic politics. Now, Roman law was shaped, we believe, by Stoic philosophers in developing their theories of jurisprudence. And so, Marcus probably had been studying Stoic legal and political theory, like in Stoic theories of jurisprudence that we don't know anything about, that we don't read, right? And so there was probably a much more direct connection, but sadly, like, it's not. I mean, if we could go back in time and see some of the texts by legal theorists that we'd reading that were influenced by Stoicism, it'd probably be really obvious to us, like, how that's shaping his policies. The least well-known source, there are people, I've seen people who say, we don't know anything about Marcus Aurelius, which is kind of just crazy stuff that people say on the internet, right? We know more about Marcus Aurelius than we do probably about virtually any other ancient philosopher, because he was an emperor. So we have multiple statues of him at different periods in his life. We have coinage, we have inscriptions, we have cache of his private letters, we have his personal thoughts, we have 3 whole biographies of his life. We have many references in other writings. But we
Mhm.
also, the least well-known source that we have is the Roman legal digests. There are hundreds of references to Marcus Aurelius's legislative activities. And so scholars have reviewed those and concluded, they said, is there a pattern, like an agenda to his legislative action, his rescripts, as the Romans call them? His, and it's believed that, if I remember rightly, about half of them relate to improving the rights of women, slaves, and children. So he seems to have been particularly concerned with orphan children. He lost his father when he was 3 or 4, so maybe there's some connection there. And improving the rights of women, which would have been totally consistent with Stoic philosophy. One of the earliest Stoic texts by Cleanthes, we only know the titles of most early Stoic writings, and often that doesn't help us much. But some of the titles are actually statements. And so you go, okay, the actual title of the book seems to tell you something. There's a book by Cleanthes called That Virtue is the Same in Men and Women, like, that's the sort of title I like from an ancient book. That gives us a bit more information, like, and then to reinforce that, centuries and centuries later, Musonius Rufus has 2 surviving lectures about how virtue is the same in men and women. So I think the Stoics people would say they're not exactly proto-feminists in any sense of the word, but certainly compared to the rest of Roman society and Greek society, they seemed place more importance on women's rights, and held women in higher regard than would have been the norm. For instance, in ancient Greek philosophy, women, even in Roman society, women were treated as inferiors largely, but women were almost like slaves in classical Athens, and they weren't allowed to leave the house normally, except to perform certain kind of menial tasks. And women, where philosophers did gathered in the gymnasia like the Lyceum and the academy, women weren't allowed to set foot in there. There's a story that Plato had 2 female students, but they had to disguise themselves as men to get into the grounds of the academy.
Mm-hmm.
But for the Stoics to say virtue is the same in men and women, and for Marcus to say women should be educated in philosophy is quite a radical departure from the conventions of their society. So there's that aspect of his legislation. And then there are many pieces of legislation where Marcus seems to be trying to improve the rights of slaves to obtain their freedom, to obtain manumission, as it's called in Roman law. And there was even a law that's named after him that we don't know the content of, annoyingly, but it's often cited, and it's phrased as this slave obtained his freedom legally in accord with the ruling of the deified Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus set some kind of legal precedent that we don't know that was repeatedly used in Roman law to justify granting freedom for slaves. Under what circumstances? It's kind of complicated, but for instance,
Sure.
If an owner committed a crime against a slave, it might be that then under Roman law that the slave was granted their freedom, and so on. But that would be consistent with with Stoic, arguably consistent with Stoic ethics. Because again, contrary to what many people say, there's evidence that the Stoics, from the time of the early Stoa, at least in some cases, criticized the institution of slavery. Diogenes Laertius tells us that the founders of Stoicism said that slavery is bad or unethical. And then we see fragments of that or echoes of that in subsequent writings. There are undoubtedly Stoics that had a more moderate view of slavery. Like Seneca thinks you should be nice to your slaves, but not that, they deserve, there's a problem with the institution per se. Whereas I think there's reason to believe that Marcus thought the institution was problematic. And that in an ideal world, like in the ideal Stoic republic, there would be no slaves. Actually, we know that here's a little bit of an inference for you. Zeno's republic, which was heavily based on, Stoicism is based on a political treatise, right? So Zeno's republic, which is lost, but there's lots of tantalizing references to it, describes this kind of utopian Stoic society. There's no slaves in it because Zeno says there's no property in the Stoic republic. So there cannot be slaves. And it seems to be implied that there are no slaves. Everybody wears the same type of clothing in this society. So it may be right from the outset the Stoics had questioned the institution. Now, that does not mean that the Stoics thought that they should immediately go out and ban slavery. Because Marcus also says that he, rather than political revolution, he believes that you have to be satisfied in making one small step at a time if it's in the right direction. So he very explicitly says he believes in progressive political change. Now, you could say, if Marcus Aurelius woke up one morning and said, I'm going to write a decree banning slavery, he'd be dead before, the ink had dried on
before
it.
sundown, yeah.
Right? So realistically, he couldn't do that. So did he take any steps at all? Well, he took many small steps to make it easier for slaves to obtain their freedom. So, we can make of that what we will. So there's reason. But you asked what's the best evidence. I suppose the most obvious example is there's a speech that Marcus gave on the eve of the Civil War. He would have been in He was in Sirmium, and he gathered, he would have been speaking presumably mainly to the Praetorian cohorts, and he gave a speech which we're told was then sent to the Senate. It must have been published. Now, it's in Cassius Dio. Many people would say, reading this seems implausible. At the end of the speech, he even says, "This may seem incredible to you," highlighting the fact that this speech seems remarkable. Right? So some historians have said he can't have said this, right, because of the content of the speech. However, Cassius Dio is one of our, in certain regards, Cassius Dio is one of our best sources because he was a senator under Commodus. Like, he was around at the time, he was alive during the reign of Marcus Aurelius and close to the action. He says that this is a speech that was sent to the Senate and given to the army and circulated in public. So an argument that historians make is, in situations like that, it's harder for someone to fabricate the content because people would have said, that's not what Marcus said in that famous speech that he gave, you know?
Right.
So it's harder for him to make up stuff like that. And what he says in the speech is there are several things that seem Stoic. First of all, he says we shouldn't complain about this, what seems like a catastrophe. He says that I assume that he's not doing this out of malice, but he's doing it in error, which is like the Socratic principle that no man does evil knowingly, which Marcus refers to repeatedly in the Meditations. And he says that this is interesting to compare to modern American politics. Marcus says that because this guy has impeached his authority as emperor, he would have been willing to step down voluntarily from the position of emperor and appear in front of a Senate or military hearing and argue his case out in front of Avidius Cassius and his critics and allow the Senate to decide. Right? So Marcus was very into sharing power with the Senate. He was known for that. He wouldn't make political appointments without consulting the Senate. He appointed a co-emperor who perhaps, we're not sure, but may have had the power, but theoretically, to veto some of Marcus's decrees if he had to. He seemed to want to place more limits on the power of. It's interesting because there's a debate in American politics. You know, could the president pardon himself? Can the president be prosecuted for certain crimes while he's in office or after he's in office and things like that? So, you know, we have this debate going on in America about how much power the office of president has. And in Roman society, you have the same thing, but Marcus is very much in favor of limiting those powers. You know, he wants a more democratic system and more power sharing. He's concerned about the office being abused by autocrats, for obvious reasons. So in the speech, he offers to step down, and it's crazy. Like, he says it's too late to do that. You might say that's convenient, just because this guy's already declared war, right? So we can't really, it's not really feasible to do that anymore. And he says that the best that I hope we can achieve from this would be to show the world that there's a way that's just and wise of dealing even with a civil war. Like, so rather than kind of basking in glory or revenge or anything like that, he says the opposite. But the goal is to demonstrate to the world that we are bigger and better than this, and that we have the dignity, and the justice and the wisdom to deal with this in a prudent manner. Mm-hmm. Now, there is a criticism of Marcus Aurelius I think it's in the Historia Augusta, that suggests that some people thought he was more kind of cunning and less sincere than he seemed. I don't know that there's a lot of evidence for that. I can find one piece of evidence for it, which is that the story that we receive is that Avidius Cassius was assassinated by two of his senior officers. Because it seems a little bit odd, right? And that Marcus was shocked by this, okay? And then there's a few other fragmentary pieces of information. like these two guys just decided spontaneously to assassinate their general. I guess that happens in Rome. There's a couple of problems with this. Number one, he wasn't the only person that got the chop. He in Egypt, he was in Syria. In Alexandria, the guy that he'd left in charge there as prefect of Egypt was also assassinated by the army at the same time, by coincidence. And I had the question when we were writing the biography, and I was saying, try to visualize it. How did these guys manage to put his head in a sack and walk out of Syria, surrounded by 3 legions or whatever that were loyal, and the Praetorian cohort loyal to Avidius Cassius? They just went, sure, you guys put his head in a bag, like take it to Marcus Aurelius. So at the very least, immediately in the aftermath of the assassination, whoever took command of the Praetorian cohort, Avidius Cassius's Praetorians that he'd appointed, must have given those guys permission, the assassins permission, to take the head to Marcus Aurelius. We're also told that Marcus was criticized for being too lenient to one of Avidius Cassius's sons, a son-in-law, a guy called Druncianus, who would probably have been an officer. I don't think we know this for sure, but we can assume there's a good chance he would have also been serving as a senior officer in Avidius Cassius's army. And Marcus protected him. He prohibited the senators from persecuting this guy. He made sure that he obtained most of his inheritance. And people thought, you're being too soft on this guy. Now, why? Is it just out of the kindness of his heart? Or is it because Druncianus, the son-in-law of Avidius Cassius, was involved somehow in a coup against him, and Marcus was rewarding him by giving him a share of the guy's inheritance and protecting him against persecution? So I don't know that necessarily shows that Marcus planned and organized a coup with the involvement of Avidius Cassius's son-in-law and coordinating assassinations in Egypt and in Syria. Somebody did. Like, maybe the other generals did it and then hoped that Marcus would support them. I think it's possible Marcus was corresponding with them, and this was... So that might be one of the things that people could have in mind at the time when they say, this Marcus Aurelius guy, you know, he's a little bit more of a political operator than he makes himself out to be. I don't know, it's just speculation, but I think it's another plausible interpretation of what happened there. The version that we get that just says these 2 officers suddenly decided to assassinate their general and then waltzed out of Syria with his head in a bag seems to me somewhat far-fetched. And I wouldn't be surprised if most Romans found that hard to believe.
Yeah, that might be true. On the other hand, you do have the precedent of some generals getting assassinated when the army in general is not as much of a fan of what they're up to. So perhaps I don't know if we have any records on this front. If you get enough of the people on the ground who have some discomfort about going to war with Romans.
I would have said we don't have a record of that. We could speculate about it because Cassius didn't have as many legions under his command as Marcus Aurelius. He also supposedly managed to persuade the legions to acclaim him emperor by telling them that Marcus had already died or was on the verge of dying. Now, if that's true, and then they found out that Marcus was actually alive and mobilizing a loyalist army to march against them, you can imagine that a lot of them think, well, you lied to us. And they might also think, we're all going to die because he's got more legions than us. Now, Marcus in that speech says that I'm going to pardon everybody involved in this insurrection. And so on the face of it, that seems like a kind of generous thing to do. But it's also a prudent thing to do because now they declared, the Senate had already declared Avidius Cassius public enemy, which means basically implicitly that under Roman law, he's fair game, and if somebody murders him, they won't be prosecuted for it. So Marcus is saying, all you guys in the legions, we're not going to lay a finger on you, right? And by the way, if you happen to feel like murdering this guy, we're not going to hold it against you. Like, so, again, there's maybe more layers to it, but you're right that the army may have simply thought, we're going to lose this war. This guy deceived us. So maybe, he's the only one that wants to fight, against this larger force that's heading towards us. So maybe we should just finish him off before we all die. And Marcus Aurelius is just giving us a free pass. One thing that's interesting about that is that if some rulers had said, hey, you guys don't worry about this. If you all surrender, we're just going to draw a line under it and pretend nothing happened, right? Now, if some rulers had said that, I guess like say Nero had said that, you'd think, I don't know if I believe you. But so it's interesting that they believed Marcus Aurelius when he said it, right? Now that's one of the things maybe that makes him a great leader, is that he could make promises like that, and people would be like, no, Marcus Aurelius said it, I believe him.
Mm-hmm.
I'm willing to risk my life.
That's a great point.
Stake my life on the fact that when Marcus Aurelius says we won't be punished for this, that's what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. One other topic I wanted to ask you about, just before we wrap up, is, and this connects to themes in your previous book, how central were some of the Stoic philosophical practices to Marcus Aurelius, and did you uncover any additional, or did any new stories stand out to you in that group card?
I mean, the first thing that's worth saying about that is that in the Meditations, he repeatedly says that of various exercises that he should do this frequently, that he should do it on a daily basis. So it's clear if you look at the text, and I think many people kind of pick this up intuitively, but if you look closely, the evidence is there. He's describing a formal, systematic, daily exercise regime to some extent, which is obviously very, very intriguing. I wish we knew. There are other sources that seem to suggest that's how these kind of, and Pierre Hadot, I think, in his books, does a pretty good job of gathering evidence that shows across a number of authors this assumption being made that there are these exercises that are used on a consistent basis. A good example of that, clear example, is actually an exercise that the Stoics inherit from the Pythagoreans. It's in the Golden Verses of Pythagoras, which is a text that Seneca, Galen, and Epictetus all quote the same Pythagorean text. And famously, the Golden Verses says that every morning you should prepare for the day ahead, and that every evening you should, before you close your eyes, review the preceding day 3 times and ask yourself 3 questions, which is, what did I do well? What did I do badly? And what did I omit to do, or what could I do better next time? Cicero, I think, refers to this as well, if I remember rightly. I don't think there's an explicit reference to that in Marcus Aurelius, but he must have been familiar with it. So that is very clearly a formal exercise. It couldn't be more. It's like a modern self-help. It's like there's 3 questions you must ask yourself. It's like a checklist. You do it every night before you go to bed, right? It's systematic. It's there in this very well-known text, and these Stoics refer to it. And for example, Epictetus is recommending to students that they do that. Stoicism, from the outset, was influenced by Pythagoreanism. Again, we mainly know that through a book title. So Zeno wrote a book called On Pythagorean Symbols. So right out of the gate, the founder of Stoicism clearly had studied Pythagoreanism and was writing books about it that he was handing down to his students. And then, so it's no surprise that scattered the surviving Stoic texts we get, even in Marcus Aurelius, he does talk about the Pythagoreans and emulating some of the contemplative practices that they do, but slightly different from the one I've just mentioned. So for sure, he would have done these exercises. In the Roman histories, we don't find, I think, any real explicit reference to that, although I guess that's something he would have been doing more in private. However, there's another type of exercise that we have an amazing, like one of the coolest finds is that in the 19th century, an Italian scholar found, called Angelo May, found these letters, a cache of letters that Fronto had written and some of the responses to them. Marcus Cornelius Fronto was Marcus Aurelius's Latin rhetoric tutor. And so he's corresponding with Marcus's mum, with Lucius Verus, with Avidius Cassius. Like, I mean, it's cool. Like, sometimes when you only have one historical text, you almost kind of think, are these guys are real? Like, did this even exist? Like, do we have any other evidence? But here you have Fronto writing letters to these guys, so it just is it's like gold dust, it's another little bit of evidence that makes it seem more three-dimensional and more real. And Fronto was engaged in this kind of power struggle with Junius Rusticus, Marcus Aurelius' Stoic tutor. So imagine Fronto's like a Latin sophist, in a sense. He teaches rhetoric and oratory. He teaches sophistication, culture in general, but he's not committed to a philosophy like Stoicism. He's more interested in the art of persuasion. And Marcus loves rhetoric. He's dedicated to studying it, but he seems to gradually, it's like changing your major at university or whatever. He seems to shift to wanting to commit more fully to Stoicism. He starts studying Stoicism, we're told, when he's 12 years old, or at least he starts studying some similar kind of philosophy. It may have been cynicism that he was into first, I suspect, but very soon got into Stoicism. By the time he was about 15 or so, he has Stoic tutors. But there's a letter where he seems to talk about converting from rhetoric to Stoicism when he's in his mid-20s. So it took him a while to this kind of leap to saying, no, I am now fully committed to Stoicism. And it's interesting what Fronto argues with him about. So Fronto says, look, I'm not going to diss Stoicism. He realizes that's kind of a losing gambit. He says, see, Stoicism is great, philosophy is great. But he basically says repeatedly to Marcus that the thing about philosophy is it leads to paradoxical conclusions, right? And the insights of philosophy, by their very nature, are difficult to articulate in words. And he says philosophy will get you these subtle, nuanced, profound, paradoxical insights, but you need to study language. You need to study the art of rhetoric to know how to communicate those ideas clearly and effectively. Otherwise, they can get kind of garbled. So these two things complement one another. And if you're going to be an effective ruler, you need both. Otherwise, people are going to think you're just academic. You're going to have ideas about justice that seem confusing to ordinary people. You need to know how to put this clearly and effectively into words. And this seems like a kind of convincing argument to Marcus. But Fronto is his tutor, and we can see throughout the letters, interestingly, Fronto is assigning him homework exercises, and Marcus is doing homework and sending it back to Fronto. So Fronto will say, write an essay about sleep, praising it or disparaging it. And so Marcus will write an essay and send it back to Fronto. And they'll argue about the kind of which is the best words to use in certain contexts and things like that. A little bit, you get little bits of this, but you can see Fronto clearly is giving him tuition, assigning exercises to him. Fronto tells Marcus to practice repeatedly taking philosophical ideas and paraphrasing them. So he says you have to keep turning them over and practice putting them in different words until you capture exactly the right image, figure of speech, phrase to articulate the idea. Now, that's very intriguing because when we pick up the meditations, we think, this guy seems to say the same thing over and over again in different words. Like, why was he writing this? What's it for? And it's striking because it's very unusual that in ancient history, our sources are so sparse. When two things join up like that, it's like, a eureka moment. He seems in the meditations basically to be doing what Fronto told him to do. which is to take the insights, paradoxes of philosophy and keep paraphrasing them is a way of refining his understanding and his ability to articulate them. And, when he was probably doing that for his own benefit, but it's a huge. So sometimes somebody said to me, I saw someone recently saying Marcus Aurelius isn't a great philosopher. I kind of would say maybe that's kind of half true, right? Ironically, maybe actually, I don't know if I put it like this or not, but you could say, no, Marcus Aurelius isn't an original philosopher. He's really just repeating stuff that other authors have said. Often he's just quoting other books and things. Ironically, I think, a great rhetorician. Like what he's doing in the Meditations is taking ideas from other Stoic texts and other sources and rephrasing them, but in the way that he'd been trained to do. Some people have said Marcus Aurelius isn't a great writer. I think those people are wrong, right? Because if they expect a speech like Cicero would write, Marcus gave those speeches throughout his life, but in the Meditations, he's writing aphorisms. And as an aphorist, he's excellent. Like
Right.
his command of, you look at the Greek, he has an extensive vocabulary. So first of all, which is, a sign of at least extensive education and training. It's clear from his use of the language. If you compare the Meditations to the discourses of Epictetus, the language that Arian uses to transcribe Epictetus is repetitive, it's simplistic, compared to the much more complex, diverse use of Greek language that Marcus Aurelius uses. He is a highly talented rhetorician, highly talented aphorist, and the proof of that is in the pudding. Because why does anybody bother reading the Meditations? It's partly because the powerful imagery, memorable tons of phrase that he uses. People remember the Meditations and go back and read it over and over again because it's full of so many beautifully written aphorisms. So it's absurd, in a sense, for anyone to question his ability as an aphorist. History proves that he was successful in that regard. He's one of the most quoted philosophers of antiquity, but not because he came up with original ideas, but because he took other people's ideas and articulated them in a concise and powerful manner. And Fronto tells him to go off and practice doing that. But Fronto tells him to do that when he's in his he's writing the Meditations when he's in his mid-50s. So 3 decades. Has he been doing this for 3 decades?
A long time, yeah. Perhaps he's a model practitioner in addition to a rhetorician. That there's a consistency to his life and practice. And I think that's good advice that Fronto gave him, right? This rephrasing things in your own words, internalizing the principles, thinking about them in different contexts. It just got to be an excellent exercise.
Some of the things he's doing are interesting. There's an overlap between rhetoric. I mean, the Stoics, like other Socratic philosophers, in a sense, were very critical of sophists and rhetoric, but they did also kind of recognize a place for it. There's an intersection or an overlap between rhetoric and philosophy. And so another one that you can identify is clearly in book 1 of the Meditations, you've got a structure. It's different from the rest of the book. And he names these individuals and describes their virtues. So you might think, okay, it's interesting. I guess maybe that's what he's doing. Is it like an acknowledgement section? Or is this some kind of mental exercise? Well, conveniently, later on in the Meditations, he tells us. So further on in the Meditations, he says, if you want to, one of the most effective things that you can do for benefiting yourself is to contemplate the virtues of another person and list them in your mind. And he gives some examples of this. That's exactly what he does in book 1. He describes the methodology later in the book, and he says that it's a psychological exercise. However, one of the reasons that he's able to rattle off this list, I mean, if you sat down and said, if you could concisely sum up the main virtues that you admire in someone else, it would probably take you a little while to kind of refine the list, right? Off the top of your head, you might think of 2 or 3 things, but this list that Marcus has, I can't imagine that this is, to most people, would come naturally. And the reason it comes naturally to Marcus is that as Caesar, he often had to give speeches in the Senate praising Antoninus Pius. And these are rhetorical exercises that he discusses with Fronto. Like, how do you formally praise someone? How, what can you learn from other speeches? What, qualities we use to describe as an individual, what language you use. So in the Meditations, on the one hand, this is a psychological exercise. He tells us it is. On the other hand, he's been trained through years, decades of study in rhetoric to list the key admirable qualities or character strengths of, in particular, Antoninus Pius, but also, other people. That was what you do when you give a speech at someone's funeral, a eulogy, for example. And it's the sort of thing that he would have had to done frequently on formal occasions. In Roman society, it was a very carefully worded thing. So here, again, you have this kind of intersection between his training in rhetoric and the philosophical, contemplative practices that he's doing.
Right. Yeah, that's another great point. Well, I've kept you for a while. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I guess what I would add is that I have always believed that when people get into Stoicism, they usually read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Sometimes they read some of the other stuff. I'd say, people ask me what else they should read. I'd say the most important thing that they could read in addition to that would be some of the literature about Socrates. Obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean reading the whole of Plato's Republic. There's a lot of literature, but certainly Plato's Apology, which is pretty easy to read, would be a good starting point. So, and Xenophon's Memorabilia has always had almost this kind of stronger connection with Stoicism. So Zeno was inspired to become a philosopher because he read part of book 2 of Xenophon's Memorabilia Socrates. So I would say, if you're serious about Stoicism and you've read your Marcus Aurelius and you've read Seneca and Epictetus, maybe you read Musonius Rufus, you'll say, what else should I read? So you have to read probably Xenophon, Memorabilia, Plato's Apology, and then maybe that will lead you on into reading some of the other Platonic dialogues. What you get in the Stoics is a kind of bullet point list of Socrates, Socratic philosophers. Epictetus is always telling his students to emulate Socrates. So if you love Epictetus, you'd think, this guy keeps telling me you should be more like Socrates. I guess I should find out what Socrates was like. But I think the Stoics are very much thinking of the idea of reconstructing the original Socrates. They're not remotely interested in Plato's theory of forms, for example, which is generally agreed to be something that he puts in the mouth of Socrates that was alien to him. So, and Xenophon doesn't have Socrates mention the theory of forms. Aristotle tells us that Plato invented the theory of forms. So by implication, Socrates couldn't have said anything about it. So we have to kind of like separate Plato out from Socrates. That's called the Socratic problem by scholars. But that Stoics are more interested in the idea of the original Socrates. So I think people should go back and read Xenophon, read Plato's Apology, and what they'll get are some of the philosophical arguments that are used to justify the Stoic ethics. Like the Stoics that we have, the Stoic texts that we have, do have some arguments in them, but generally they're assuming certain ethical principles and other ideas, and then they're talking about how to apply it, particularly Marcus Aurelius. Even in Marcus Aurelius, there's little fragments of argument, but mostly he's taking ideas and thinking how to apply them in daily life. And so some readers eventually are going to think, how do I know that virtue is the only true good? Like, how do I know that all the virtues are one, and that wisdom's kind of central to them and stuff like that? Well, because Socrates had already laid out those arguments, and the Stoics are taking that for granted. So if you want the kind of background philosophical foundations for Stoicism, you need to read probably Plato's Euthydemus is a good place to start. And then, scattered throughout the other dialogues.
Yeah, Gorgias also.
Gorgias.
Yeah.
And, really in Protagoras and bits, and, even in, also in book 1 of the Republic. Here's another thing, just a bit of I'll finish with a bit of trivia. The most famous Stoic passage ever, I would say safely, is people aren't upset by events, but by their opinions about them. is passage 4 of the Enchiridion. And I say that because it was quoted by Albert Ellis, who taught it to all of his clients and students. It used to be a cliche in cognitive behavioral therapy. And so that's probably the most widely quoted. Even Marcus Aurelius paraphrases that passage from Epictetus, right? But people never, or very rarely, go on and quote the following sentence. And in the next sentence, Epictetus says, because, for example, even death cannot be intrinsically terrifying, because if it were, Socrates would have been frightened of dying. So we can think, do wise men think that these things are scary or depressing or terrifying, or would they view them differently? And in that case, maybe the fear that we have has got to do with our values and our attitude. It's kind of subjective in a sense, rather than being an intrinsic quality of the thing that we're talking about. Now, apart from the fact that he uses Socrates immediately as his go-to example, and he's kind of clearly alluding to his trial and death, and probably has in mind Plato's Apology, the point he's making about our opinions and values shaping our distress, I don't believe is original to Stoicism, although we strongly associate it today with Stoicism, because that same point is made repeatedly in both Plato and Xenophon's dialogues and attributed to Socrates, at least by Xenophon. It's not stated as clearly as it is. It's definitely assumed in multiple dialogues. It's in Book 1 of Plato's Republic, although it's attributed to Cephalus rather than Socrates. Socrates is talking to someone else about that idea. But in Xenophon, this argument is very much attributed to Socrates, the idea that it's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. And so that's a good example of something that people today think of as characteristically Stoic. They're really, deriving it. I think Epictetus has in mind, I'm getting this from argument from Socrates. It's not a coincidence I'm using him as an example, because it's in the Socratic dialogues. So for sure, you can find that stuff.
That seems right to me. The memorabilia seems underrated. I agree with that. Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Donald. This has been great.
Been a pleasure. Thank you very much, as always.
Thanks for listening to Stoic Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.